screws are tightening on Iran. The world's nuclear watchdog says Iran is on the path to nuclear weapons.
I must alert the world.
The United States issues threats.
Nothing has been taken off the table.
Israel, ultimatums.
The greatest danger of all could soon be upon us.
But Iran is resolute.
You damaged the agency's dignity because of America's empty claims.
Is this more of the same old game, or will it lead to war? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. As Washington decreases its military presence in Iraq and Iran increases its political influence in Baghdad, American strategists are warning against a massive shift in the balance of power in the region in favor of Tehran, which continues to develop and expand its nuclear project despite Western condemnations and sanctions. Meanwhile, Israeli warnings of a preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear installations, if diplomatic means fail, threaten to turn a dangerous stalemate into a regional war as the precarious situations in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Bahrain spiral out of control. Has Iran reached a new threshold in its nuclear development? Is that what's worrying Western powers? Or is it Tehran's increasing regional influence? I'll discuss these issues and more with my guests. Professor Arshin Mogaddam at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and the author of Iran in World Politics. Yossi Mickelberg, Director of the International Relations Program at Webster's University's Regents College and an Associate Fellow at the Chatham House. And Dr. Roozbeh Parsi is a Research Fellow at the EU's Institute of Security Studies. And last, but by no means least, De La Piero, author of 33 books, including Iran's Today and After Empire. But first, a quick recap of the U.S. policy towards Iran and Iraq, and vice versa, since the Islamic Revolution.
Is this the smoking gun?
Iran has a case to answer.
A report comes out. The evidence appears solid, but not necessarily new. Within the confines of the IAEA, the West gets to justify tightening its grip.
Iran has carried out activities relevant to the development of a nuclear device.
Meanwhile, Iran gets to look defiant.
These allegations are all fabricated in order to have a pretext of putting pressure on Iran.
And so the pattern repeats itself once again. Israel, the United States, and Iran, all reciting from the same old script, but with a few new twists.
If Iran develops nuclear weapons, the Arab Spring could well turn into an Iranian winter.
If Iran's intransigence continues, it will face increasing pressure and isolation.
History has shown Iran's enemies have not tasted glory or victory.
But how much of this brinkmanship is justified, given that Iran's leadership has always maintained its nuclear program is not for military use?
Nuclear weapon does not add to our capability. It is more liability than asset.
Iran has clearly been moving toward a nuclear weapons capability, if not the actual decision to build an actual nuclear weapon. This seems likely to lead to a conflict, but we've been saying that for many years.
The geopolitics of this particular showdown date to the Iranian Revolution. Decades of Western interference in the region were laid bare in an instant, and once the repercussions began, Washington was forced to take sides. In the 1980s, the United States, and by extension the West, chose to back Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War. It's well known during this time Saddam ordered chemical attacks against his own people. Less well known is that he also did so against several Iranian targets. Yet this atrocity was conveniently overlooked by his friends in Washington. Meanwhile, the American administration was also doing secret illegal arms deals with Iran, and when they were caught, struggled to tell the truth.
I just didn't know.
Ronald Reagan's attempts to explain this bordered on the absurd.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
By the early 1990s, the Americans adopted a dual containment strategy with the goal of isolating both Iran and Iraq at once. But in reality, it made no sense, as two countries which loathed each other now had a common cause and common enemy in Washington. The invasion of Iraq changed the dynamic yet again, completely disrupting the balance of power and inadvertently setting the stage for this latest standoff by giving Iran a new incentive to defend itself. And all the while, the fundamental Israeli philosophy has remained unchanged.
Israel is the first target, but it certainly won't be the last.
Now, we can argue about whether that position is justified, but I don't think we can argue that this is pure propaganda. In other words, I think the Israelis actually genuinely believe it.
Which brings us to today. From Washington's perspective, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have helped rid the world of terrorists and dictators. But Tehran sees another motive as it finds itself increasingly surrounded by American might. So, what's the solution?
One possibility is that the Iranians make it clear that they're not going to go the whole way, and in a sense give themselves a possibility to do it technically but not actually do it, and then invite the Atomic Energy Authority in to basically see clearly how far they've got. That would be quite a clever move.
Within Iran, there is overwhelming support for a domestic nuclear industry. And it's not just pro-Ahmadinejad supporters who utterly reject the hypocrisy that allows Israel to have nuclear weapons, but not Iran.
In a sense, the nuclear program is part of an Iranian perception of modernity, that it is a 21st century country with 3,000 years of history and must be taken seriously. But that does not mean that they've taken the decision themselves to develop nuclear weapons.
The Iranian nuclear program, although it's been steady, it's been directed, it's been very serious, it's never been what you would call a crash program, and it still doesn't look like a crash program. They're moving methodically.
Understanding the importance of this point reveals that just as the West has been playing this international game to gain advantage, so too has Iran. And so the diplomatic maneuvering continues its twists and turns, much like Iran's nuclear program.
Gentlemen, let's start with the timing. Do you think this has to do with new revelations by the IAEA, or do you think this has to do more with American withdrawal from Iraq?
I think it has to do with the fact that the United States is opposed to Iran being a regional power. So the IAEA reports feed into the whole political context and the geopolitical context that we are facing in that region, and the competition between the United States as a global superpower and Iran as a regional power. So the IAEA reports cannot be detached from the geopolitical competition. The facts only work to the extent that they feed into that rivalry, and they are interpreted within the context of that rivalry. So starting the discussion by actually looking at whether or not the IAEA actually delivered that smoking gun is, in my opinion, a fallacy, because you have to look at the context in the first place.
So you think the Atomic Agency is being manipulated for geopolitical reasons?
It's possible, but one question, whether the facts are true or not, and if they are correct and Iran developing nuclear capability of some sort, this is one thing. And what are the geopolitical implications of it? Of course, there are different things, but the reality with nuclear weapons, unlike other type of weapons, there is a point that it's irreversible, or it's much more dangerous and difficult to reverse. And the international community, if they oppose and actually going to do something to stop it, they need to say, what is the point of no return that we need to act? And whether international organizations are manipulated or not, it's definitely a possibility.
So, Roosevelt, tell us what actually is in this report that is new, that talks about a threshold or a point of no return?
Well, I think a lot of us were a bit underwhelmed by the report because it doesn't really contain that much new. I mean, what it does is to incorporate things that most people have suspected or claimed to know for several years. And so what it shows is, or it claims to be able to prove, that Iran had some kind of systematic weaponization program up until 2003, which in and of itself is not new. So everything that happens after that is much more hazy because there is much less to go on in terms of data to interpret.
So you actually don't think there's anything in this very recent report that we didn't know before, and all what there is being used for geopolitical?
Well, basically what we're dealing with is a political problem. And we're trying to grasp for the technical details because we like to think that those are objective. They're not part of geopolitical game. But that's not the case. Because when you're dealing with nuclear stuff, it's always within a geopolitical context. And in this one, what everyone who wants to squeeze Iran, in a sense, have decided is that it's enough shocking and enough news to be able to use it to squeeze Iran.
Is this a question of Iran actually developing the capacity to have a bomb, or is it not?
There is a change of person at the top. As long as al-Baradei was in charge, as he said that he used to be very careful with the final draft. He said in one case he redrafted the whole thing 30 times, because he did not want to give the Western powers any leeway to come around and say, let's hit Iran. Now we have a different Director General, and he is therefore not as cautious. And in fact, Mr. Baradei himself said that, you know, to get rid of Saddam Hussein, to kill 1 million people, that kind of a thing is not on. Before we go on, ask a simple question. Why did Israel go on and develop nuclear bomb? From the mid-1950s. Why? Because Israel felt that when push comes to shove, the Western powers will not be able to or will not protect it. It's the same attitude behind Iran and its rulers. They want to make sure that their realm remains secure. And therefore, whatever they're doing is defensive. It's not something they want to use against Iran or against Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. That's the driving point.
But is it ambiguity then that they are pushing, or is it actually acquiring the capacity but not developing the bomb?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, we have to look at what happened during Iran-Iraq War. Everything flows from Iran-Iraq War in 1980 to 88. In March 1985, Saddam Hussein launched what's called War of the Cities. It went on for 1 month. Before that, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the Republic, he was against any nuclear thing because it's un-Islamic, because nuclear bomb does not distinguish between fighters and civilians. Whatever Iran is doing defensively, and yes, they would want to have this bomb not to go against somebody, but to protect themselves.
In fact, Yossi, one of the leading Israeli strategists suggested after the 2003 war that if Iran did not develop the bomb before, it would be stupid not to develop it after that war, because now it's surrounded by American forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere in the Gulf.
I would argue the opposite, because after Iraq, Iran is in the best position ever probably in the region, because its major enemy has been weakened, and as a result of it, they have the hegemony in the region, regardless if they have nuclear.
But now you're talking after 2005, when the American occupation started to fail and civil war started to take place. But in 2003, America was pretty much mission accomplished.
Right now, in many ways, Iran is such in a strong position because the rest of the West and Israel mess the rest of the region. So they have more access to Lebanon, they have more access to the Hamas, which is Sunni-based, more access to Iraq in a way they didn't have before 2003. Developing nuclear weapon means joining an exclusive club, and when you join an exclusive club, you need to behave in a certain way. It also means that the minute that there is a confirmation of a military capability, the rest of the world will look at it, including Israel, and will target Iran in a way that it wouldn't do today. A lot about with nuclear weapons is about intention, about perception. The kind of language, for instance, that comes from Ahmadinejad, for whatever reason, domestically, regionally, will be treated very differently with being backed by nuclear weapons. I think the current position is actually Iran's best position.
In fact, the question of ambiguity, the question of ambiguity is quite important here, because it seems that whether it is a question of what's so-called taqiyya, meaning they actually don't want to say what their real intentions are until they reach their goal. So whether they are developing nuclear weapons or not, it remains their strategy to conceal it. Or second, that for the time being, it's helpful for them to develop that and to keep saying that they're not, simply to avoid more international pressure or perhaps an international strike against them.
One could say they're following the Israeli model in that regard. But the sense of...
Don't tell them that, though.
No, I wouldn't. But the sense of insecurity is really what is important here. it's not a sense of insecurity that is in any way irrational or that has nothing to do with the realities of modern Iranian history. Iranian history is littered with impingement on Iranian politics, with the coup d'etat in 1953, with what happened during the Iran-Iraq war, with the build-up of the WMD infrastructure of Saddam Hussein during that war. And after that, the ongoing talk of military confrontation, sanctions, confrontations in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So it is the sense of insecurity that feeds into the security doctrine of the Islamic Republic. So one way of dealing with that sense of insecurity and of actually warding off the development of a nuclear weapon would actually to have a grand bargain, to emphasize diplomacy and to address that sense of insecurity in order to have that nuclear weapon as a taboo topic within Iran.
I think there are two added elements here that differs Iran from Israel, for instance, but also makes a difference between the international setting and the regional setting. And that is the fact that Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that ambiguity is necessary just to be able to kind of lawyer up and withstand the scrutiny to some degree. But the other aspect of it is that if Iran were to actually weaponize and assemble a nuclear bomb and tell everyone, while it would ward off the Americans on the international scene, it would actually lose in a regional setting. Because once you have the bomb and you're starting to show it off, you're going to get the Egyptians and everyone else thinking about it. And once everyone has one, then your strategic advantage of being a regional power is somewhat lost. If Bahrain can afford one, then they're par with you, which in every other aspect they're not.
I sense there's a discrepancy here. So, tell us, is Iran then developing nuclear weapons in an ambiguous fashion? Or is the IAEA report not accurate and it's just basically an instrument of Western powers?
If I were an Iranian decision maker, I would aim for the ambiguity of having breakout capacity. Considering the history of the region and where things are going, that would be a very rational decision to make. If they had been steadily doing it and that was the end goal they were aiming for, after all these years they would have managed one. So obviously the intention and the political calculus is what really counts, and that one we don't know.
See, the whole thing IAEA is going on. Look at India and Pakistan. Pakistan went in to acquire a nuclear bomb because they knew that in conventional war they will never be able to beat India. And the moment they acquired atom bomb with active support of China, in fact the atom bomb assembled was tested in China in February 1984. See, so that is the whole point, because Pakistan always afraid. India is so big, and if any conventional war, we will be finished off. And very importantly, when there was very tense situation between the two countries, Pakistan refused to say that we will not have the first strike of nuclear power, because that they are keeping this as their important card.
And you see here the parallel between them and Iran and Israel and the United States?
Absolutely.
Israel in the 50s is very different, for instance, from Iran now. Israel in the 50s, even Pakistan, because there is a conventional military asymmetry in the 50s, or even Pakistan or India, Iran actually is in a quite strong position, but at the same time, I completely agree with you, there is always a sense of insecurity as most revolutions.
No, it isn't actually in a strong it isn't actually in a strong position. I mean, when you compare conventional military capability of Israel and Iran, I mean, there is no comparison, of course. Iran does not have the military capabilities today to launch any kind of invasion of any of its neighbors. And its security doctrine is not geared to any kind of invasion. To secure the borders continues. This has been historically the primary objective of Iranian states, and it is until today.
I always find this, Iran isolated. Iran isolated. Isolated from what? Iran is in bed with China. Iran is in bed with Russia. Where is Russia? Russia is next to Caspian Sea. You know, I mean, they are neighbors. To say Iran is, isolated.
Is Iran isolated?
It's all, brainwashing.
No, I don't think Iran is isolated, at least not to the level that most Western countries would like to believe or would like to aim for. That, of course, doesn't mean that Iran is just enjoying international life and managing its economy splendidly, etc., etc.
It is difficult for the Iranians to withstand American forces surrounding it from all sides and asking for regime change in Tehran.
And at the same time, you know, all the other countries in the region have highly developed military, conventional military capabilities.
So you don't think Obama's assurances Do the Iranians have held that we will deal with you on mutual respect and on the basis of mutual respect?
Well, it was rhetoric. I mean, discourse is important. I'm not saying that when Obama came in and he opened up the door, I'm not saying that this was merely rhetoric and it didn't have an impact.
It was too late?
It was a new movement towards a new discourse, a new rhetoric, but it was not backed up by actual action.
And now they are in a situation of comfort with an advantage in Iraq. Maybe, and that's the thing, go back to my first question, what is worrying Washington and other capitals in Europe?
Well, obviously, I mean, but that's inevitable. I think, I mean, one of the things that strikes me as somewhat strange is that when you look at how the Western powers have tried to deal with and understand what's going on in the Middle East, they seem to forget one of the basic laws, if you will, that most people in the region understand. There's a difference between a permanent neighbor and a guest. And the Americans are guests. They're never going to stay that long, so you can never trust or count on them to the same degree as when you know that you have a neighbor who's going to stick around.
Well, we're going to talk about another neighbor that some think they're guests and some other people think they are fixtures in the region. We'll do that after we come back from a news break. But before we do, here is the latest tale of assassinations and dirty tricks by the intelligence agencies.
On the surface, it is pure farce.
Agents of Iran conspire to set off bombs in Washington, D.C. and assassinate a young ambassador.
This is a very radical group of people.
They have contempt for the United States.
It seems to me they have gotten away with a lot.
This certainly sets the stage for what could be Saudi retaliation, Israeli retaliation.
The plot involves secret payments of hundreds of thousands of dollars, a cousin who was a big general in the Iranian army, and members of the Mexican drug cartels. But the more details that emerged about the so-called mastermind behind the operation, Mansour Arbarbsiar, the less likely it seemed.
It reads like the pages of a Hollywood script.
Conspiracy to murder a foreign official, to use a weapon of mass destruction, to commit an act of international terrorism, conceived, sponsored, and was directed from Iran.
The Americans started rattling sabers.
We will not let other countries use our soil as their battleground.
Iran must be held accountable for its actions.
The Iranian response to these accusations was to be expected.
Why should the Iranian people go inside the U.S. and kill the ambassador of a friendly country?
Such scenarios prove the political fluster and desperation of the United States.
But such far-fetched schemes are straight out of the CIA and Mossad's playbook, and something's definitely going on. 3 Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated in the past 2 years, and there was an attempt to kill another nuclear physicist by sticking a bomb to the side of his car as he drove through Tehran traffic. A mysterious cyber virus called Stuxnet set back Iran's nuclear program by years. And recently, there was an accidental explosion at the Al Ghadir missile base that killed the architect of the country's nuclear missile program. So, what next?
The toughest sanctions, economic, diplomatic pressures on Iran to change their behavior.
And perhaps more, much more.
We are not taking any options off the table.
Welcome back. Although war has hardly ever resolved any problem or dispute in the Middle East, the region, which makes up 6% of the world population, accounts for 20% of its armed conflicts. And this is about to increase by more than a notch if Israel and its friends have it their way. They continue to incite against Iran and threaten a preemptive attack against its nuclear capabilities. If this scenario materializes, it could develop into a fully fledged war that could burn the whole region. If this is hard to imagine, a preview of this dramatic war scenario is perhaps in order.
The greatest danger facing Israel and the world is the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran.
And Israel is prepared to do something about it. The plan, Plan A, would see Israel launching a limited, surgical, preemptive strike, attacking with long-range aircraft and armed drones, firing cruise missiles from its submarines in the Arabian Sea, or launching its latest Jericho-3 missiles. But the Iranians have learnt from history. They have spread and concealed their nuclear installations across the country. So in this scenario, Instead of hitting a single target like in Iraq or Syria, Israel would have to target all 7 Iranian nuclear reactors.
In this sort of surgery, many people die. The Israelis could attack Iranian nuclear facilities, but they wouldn't be able to inflict long-term permanent damage.
And Iran would have to retaliate.
If Iran retaliates, every U.S. ally in the region or Israeli ally in the region is a potential target.
Iran's ally, Syria, could also join in. Plus Iran's proxy forces, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, would fire rockets into Israel. And there's the possibility of unconventional attacks on Israeli interests across the world.
An Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities would likely only accelerate the Iranian desire to obtain nuclear weapons. So this idea that you would attack certain facilities in Iran and leave Iranian retaliatory capabilities intact breaks every rule in the military and political playbook.
So, what's Plan B?
The United States and the international community are determined to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
The US military have had plans really since the fall of the Shah for military action.
Cyber warfare is stage 1. Stage 2, in the military sense, would be massive ordnance air blast bombs, or MOAB, mother of all bombs. This is the most powerful traditional military non-nuclear bomb that the US has in their arsenal. There are also new generation of bunker busters.
An American strike would be neither limited nor surgical.
A massive American attack on Iran would be able to attack some 10,000 different aim points, more or less overnight.
Their plans would destroy all Iranian air and sea bases and hit all known nuclear facilities. Iran would be left in flames.
The Americans would claim that these were surgical strikes, although I'm sure there would be very, very considerable casualties, of course, but mostly off camera.
If the US or Israel hit a nuclear reactor that is going at full steam, you have potential of a giant dirty bomb, and then the civilian deaths could be in the hundreds of thousands.
This conflict, with estimates of between 1 and 2 million Iranian civilians dead, could get out of hand.
You got to be careful of unintended consequences here.
Best laid plans of mice and men don't always come to fruition. Chaos theory can come into play. This is uncharted territory for both America and Israel.
After such a massive offensive, Iran would fire everything it had left towards Israel. It would launch wave after wave of attacks against Western targets in Iraq and Afghanistan, and damage ports and oil refineries in the Gulf. The US would ask its NATO allies for support, dragging Turkey and the 2 nuclear powers, Russia and China, reluctantly into the conflagration.
After the first stage of an attack on Iran, this could balkanize the global geopolitical scene into a new Cold War scenario.
The consequences for the world as a whole are a terrible return to 19th century power politics, which of course produced the First World War.
The result could be apocalyptic. A new wave of global violence could follow, and soaring oil prices would be the final blow to a global economy in chaos. Are such doomsday scenarios bluff, psychological warfare, or is the world really prepared to go this far?
You know, it's disturbing just watching this.
Absolutely.
You see, what do you think? Is the war scenario realistic for you?
I think, famous words to say low likelihood. But it's a possibility, and I think countries sometimes can talk themselves into war, moving from war of words to actually war itself. And I think you sense this in Israel. Even the former head of the Mossad, Meir Dagan, said, "No, this is crazy." The consequences we just saw in the clip can be. I don't know if it's a Third World War or not, but the target's there in the retaliation, because they need to contemplate even. If it's successful, what would be the retaliation? What happens if it fails? Then there are complications and implications to Israel's deterrence in the region. So
certainly it will push Iran to certainly then develop nuclear weapons.
Yeah, of course. It also depends you know, what kind of operation against Iran? Is it only Israel? It's Israel in the United States? Would they manage to dismantle in this case? How much of the Israeli Air Force will be lost? Some talk about 25% of the force lost in this way. So any Israeli prime minister, when the chief of staff would come and say, here is the scenario, and what you probably will think more than twice before sanction. Had it not been the case, probably would have been an operation long time ago.
But Roosevelt, it seems to me that when Israelis attacked in the past, they didn't say so much about it. They didn't prepare the whole world for it. They attacked Syria, they attacked Iraq. They hardly said anything.
No, that's the difference. I mean, usually when Israel wants to do something, they do it in the quiet. They don't go around having press releases about it all the time. So in that sense, you can say that the war of words that we're having now would be an indication that there is no plan at the moment to actually conduct an attack. And
I think the war of words is exactly that, the war of words.
Well, to some degree, but at the same time, we also have to remember that the problem with the script, where all they're playing their parts, is that they've gotten used to these parts, and they're good at them. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu has been talking about Iran for more than a decade now, and he always compares it to Hitler Germany. And Ahmadinejad on his side, of course, has his own way of describing the region and being very anti-Israeli in rhetoric. So in that sense, I think we shouldn't take it for granted it's just words. I mean, we should be careful about the fact that they can end up having a war, not because they want one necessarily, but because they talk themselves into it.
Do you think there is a scenario of a psychological warfare being waged by Israel and the United States in order to coerce Iran into becoming more transparent?
Any reference to what Israel did in Iraq in 1981 and Syria 2007 doesn't apply. It was only one-off, okay? In this case, the program of Iran is scattered all over the place. So that's one. Secondly, I remember a piece done by David Sanger in New York Times. He talked to an expert. He said it will require more than 1,000 strikes to do the proper job. And it can't be done one way. You have the first bombing, and then after 10 days, you can go again. In those 10 days, what will happen? The whole Middle East and the Arab, the Muslim world will rise up. So it's not so simple that, oh, we go in and bomb and etc.
So do you think we are still in the logic of psychological warfare or not then?
Yeah, of course it is psychological. They are trying to scare the mullahs. But I have to say that mullahs are not easily scared. They have been living with this since 1979. They've gone through so many things.
But Dilip, if they're not scared, then why do they keep repeating something that's not working? This usually is a sign of craziness.
Yes, of course, they do. Ultimately, simple question: are they allowed to refine uranium or not? If they can refine up to 3.5%, 20%, why not to 85, 90%? That particular right they will never give up. That's the key point, because if they give up that right, that means they are saying we will not protect our Islamic Republic. That will never happen under any circumstances. That's one. Secondly, their, shall I say, strategic relationships are developing very strongly with China.
And so they don't care about an Israeli threat? Because they feel protected globally?
Yes, of course.
Is there an American-Israeli complicity here, or is it an American-Israeli disagreement? Because if America is on board, I don't think the problem of 1,000 to 2,000 attacks is going to make any difference.
No, there is, I think, disagreement to a certain degree on the issue of war. So the Americans have repeatedly signaled to the Israelis that if they would even contemplate going ahead with even surgical strikes, they wouldn't get any backing from the United States. There is method in the madness, so to say. So there are a couple of sane people around who have tried to get the war issue off the table. At the same time, I agree that one could be hostage to fortune, a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we continue to re-emphasize that war is the last option, and we continue to say, well, if they don't react, then we need to go to war, then we know what has happened. I agree with the gloomy outlook of the report. It would be Armageddon, it would be disastrous, it would probably a war on a global scale, because this is what happened when you pit a regional powerhouse with a global superpower. And Iran's, by the way, talking about the issue of isolation, Iran's strategic alliances are not confined to the region. They have strategic alliances in Latin America as well.
But you see, the problem with all of that is those who argue for a strike, they argue from a very simple perspective, agree with it or not. Basically saying, look, it's easier to fight Iran today than to fight a nuclear Iran tomorrow. So maybe the cost will be huge, but we're going to do it anyway. First. Second, that if Israel does end up doing it, it will eventually drag the United States along anyway.
This is the analysis that should be on top of everything. There is no military solution to the nuclear issue in Iran. So no military strike can actually stop the nuclear program. If they would want to go for a nuclear weapon, a strike would facilitate the move towards nuclear weapons.
I think I both agree and disagree, because I mean, in one sense, I think it's, when you look at Iran and disbursement of these facilities, etc., it's going to be more than a surgical strike to do anything, even to delay it for a year or two. But I think the domestic politics of the United States is such that if Israel were to decide to go on its own, they know more or less sure that any American president would be pressured by Congress, by Senate, by public opinion to join in.
But the Pentagon,
and if the Americans come in, they're basically going to industrially degrade Iran 20, 30 years. They're not
like they did to Iraq.
Yes.
Why is that so unrealistic?
I don't think
it's been done before.
I don't think that's unrealistic in the sense that it's not doable. Whether it will buy you more than 10, 15 years is a different question. And the question no one wants to ask, in a sense, is will the region look worse after that or better? And I think we would all agree probably that it's going to look much worse. But if your sole cyclopic vision is they shouldn't have nuclear weapons or anything near it, then of course everything but that looks better.
What happens when Iran has nuclear weapons? We sort of talked ourselves that Iran will never have nuclear weapons, we won't allow, instead of actually thinking what happens the day after they have nuclear weapons and what kind of Middle East is going to develop and how this can actually be deterred.
Tell us, what sort of Middle East will it be?
I think it's a Middle East.
Two states threatening each other and maybe nothing will happen, like India, Pakistan, or Moscow, Washington. Or
And exactly, it's probably it will have to move to something along the Cold War deterrence. We're setting exactly the prices what happened. Unless you believe that Iranians are completely irrational and people just press buttons.
But if anything, they have proved to be quite rational the last 30 years.
Exactly.
Their policy towards Iraq, their policy towards Israel, in general, they proved to be quite pragmatic.
Exactly, and because they proved to be rational, probably they develop certain levels of high level of deterrence that might even serve as a stabilizer in the Middle East instead of the opposite. The big danger, if I just finish this, is the proliferation. And what happens also if the leak of knowledge and technology and material into non-state actor, and this needs to be addressed as well.
Let's say Iran has nuclear weapons. They also have a delivery. And let's say that they have actually fired off 1 or 2 or 3 against Israel. What happens? As we know, Israel has submarine and they're equipped with their nuclear bombs, and they are constantly in the Persian Gulf area. so that it's not a question that they will have to wait, oh my God, we're totally destroyed, nobody can. There will be a reprisal. And can you imagine how many targets there are in Iran? Hundreds of targets. So Iran will be wiped out. I mean, who do you think, which mullah would go for doing what I described, actually hit Israel with a nuclear weapon? No.
Let's stay with the present scenario. If Iran is attacked today, what capacity does it have to expand the landscape of war against Israel, the United States, and others in the region?
Of course, what will happen, there will be a reaction, because as we speak, Iran's intelligence agencies have their agents, etc., all over into the Gulf region. They have their agents, etc., in Lebanon, and of course Hamas and so on and so forth. They will make life very difficult for Israel. And of course, in terms of America still has troops in Iraq. Whatever number is there, they will make Muqtada al-Sadr will go into overdrive. Okay, and of course they are in Afghanistan, Americans, and that will make life miserable for them. So this will be the reaction at the ground level.
So you agree then that a strike will trigger a major, perhaps regional war?
I wish I could be the original person to say this. You know who has said this before me? Robert Gates. Robert Gates, the defense secretary of the USA, has said this war will have unintended consequences, one, and secondly...
And Mr. Panetta, the current defense minister, is actually...
No, but he also said we don't want to start another war because we know what happened in Afghanistan, we know what happened in Iraq. So I think that there are sensible people. They were afraid of Saddam Hussein, mullahs, because the war went on for too long. But I don't think they're very afraid of Israel.
Well, so sanctions don't seem to be working. Iran is not exactly isolated. A strike or strikes, an attack or so, might lead to regional war, hence that doesn't sound very realistic or rational for people to carry it. What is then the third option? Can we be witnessing now the development of proxy wars in the Middle East, that Iran, the United States, and Israel will start running wars in various countries, whether it's in Iraq, Bahrain, Syria certainly is going on, Lebanon?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what I would want to happen. That is a security architecture that actually works. A security architecture that stops being exclusive, that includes Iran as a regional power. If we realize and if we accept, which is the reality, that Iran has access to all these spaces, that it is a regional power, it seems to me entirely irrational that we spend all our intellectual forces to think about war and the sanctions and confrontation. Why don't we start thinking about an inclusive security architecture for the region?
Rashid, this sounds wonderful. But let's look at the realities of the Middle East. We have arming of the Syrian opposition because everyone understands that the Syrian regime is allied with Iran. There are Gulf leaders who are calling to cut the snake's head, as it were, and they are hoping for some sort of a containment of Iran. There are Israeli threats and warnings. There is a huge American armada in the region, and any accident can take place any day and could lead to an escalation of war. So is this the thing that we're witnessing today, a third option that's just going to be long and difficult and involve a lot of people in some kind of low-intensity war?
No, I think there is actually interest in the United States to get some kind of accommodation with Iran. And I believe it's the same in Iran as well. And there have been low-level diplomatic contacts. And I think it could be a beginning towards a new chapter between the countries. If the presidency, let's put it that way, if the presidencies of Obama and Khatami would have coincided, then we would be at a very different place as we are today.
Let us look at economics. Supposing all this that we're talking about, a strike, Iran, etc., happens, what happens to the oil price? Go up. Secondly, US and the European Union is in deep crisis economically. All of that will escalate.
World recession.
So what's the point of hitting this Iran, etc., and creating more tension? Even already Iraq is not fully done. Afghanistan is running sore. US and Pakistan are quarreling with each other, and all that to start another, hot war is going to be destructive of
everyone included.
Economic system.
Tell me something, you work in a European institute. We haven't discussed Europe yet. We know Russia and China are not exactly encouraged by the new pressures on Iran. They're not taking the UN seriously. Europe, is it playing a bridge here, a bridging game of sort, or is it just being a follower of US policies in the region?
I think you can say that both the United States and the European Union are deeply inflicted by something we could call policy inertia. That is, that we can come up with all kind of rational reasons why they should change their policy, but the point is that they've been doing for so long that the sanctions drive, the notion of pressure working, etc., none of these have really that much of an empirical basis, but they do it because it's the default position.
No, but can you say it more clearly? It has failed.
Well,
hasn't it?
They don't think of it in terms of failure. They think of it of something that we know how to do, and hence we will do it again and again, because no one wants to pay the political price to come up, stick out their neck, come up with a different political alternative.
Let's talk about the alternative. So what's wrong, Yossi, with a nuclear-free Middle East then?
First of all, I think going with a bit of utopia because it can be made into reality. Because I think there is a need for new, as you call it, security architecture, in the sense that what Obama actually came, and it was mentioned earlier, let's engage with Iran. Because in any good diplomacy, you need the sticks and the carrots. What you get if you change your policy. And when Obama came, there were the carrots there, and when he became a president, we all moved again to the same old sticks.
The former head of the Atomic Agency, Mohammed al-Baradei, said, Iran is no donkey. It's a regional power. It shouldn't be treated not with sticks and not with carrots.
But you need to have a good diplomacy that will also show the Iranians what they get out of changing that. One of the problems is also the rhetoric that comes from Iran, and especially from Ahmadinejad. Because it always, Ahmadinejad is always a one-man casus belli. And every time that he opens his mouth.
But is that out of defensiveness
it exacerbates
or out of offensiveness?
It's a bit of incompetency, to be honest.
Yeah,
I mean, there is no doubt about that. I mean, it's
it covers for domestic incompetence.
Yes,
so what you do, you export your domestic issues into external issues. From Israel's point of view, I think they get it completely wrong. Iran is not their main problem. resolving the issue with the Palestinians should be top of their priorities. What happens in the Arab Spring, immediately Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, those are big issues.
So there is the same degree of populism in Israel by the Netanyahu government, I guess.
Yeah, Netanyahu, it's nothing new that he's a populist.
Right-wing politics is always dependent on the enemy image. It doesn't matter whether it is here, in the United States, in Iran or Israel. There needs to be an enemy to be combated for, and it's always also for domestic reasons and for domestic politics. And it goes for Ahmadinejad, Netanyahu, the George W. Bush administration. And I'm very worried about what is coming out of the presidential candidates from the Republican side. They seem to outdo each other when it comes to Iran, and everyone wants to be the big macho on that topic, and it's quite worrying what they're talking about, I have to say. So.
Gentlemen, we will have to call it a day. Thank you for joining Empire, and I will be back with a final thought. Since the 1980s, the US, Israel, and their allies have been warning about Iran's development of a nuclear bomb. And since they repeat themselves tirelessly, I thought I might do the same. Here is what I said 2 years ago. In 1981, Washington estimated with a high degree of certainty that Iran could have nuclear weapons in 2 to 3 years. The following year, a congressional report predicted Iranian nukes within months. And in 1995, US Defense Secretary William Perry claimed that Iran may be less than 5 years from building the bomb. In 1998, US General Anthony Zinni said Iran could have the capacity to deliver nuclear weapons within 5 years. And in 2000, the CIA couldn't rule out Iranian possession of nuclear weapons. And in 2006, the US military was reportedly operating under the assumption that Iran is 5 years away. While in 2009, German intelligence sources warned of Iran as a nuclear power in 6 months. And this year, US and Israeli officials predicted Iranian warheads by 2014, and prototype may only be months away. Look, the boys crying wolf must remember, when the truth finally catches up with them, it might be too late to do anything about it. And that's the way it goes. Write to me at empire@aljazeera.net. Until next time.